Well, let's talk a little bit about Whitey Bulger. A lot of people don't really know the story of Whitey. Whitey privilege. I guess that's what we're accusing Mueller of giving Bulger Whitey privilege. And he did. He had a lot of privilege as a mobster. He was serving 2 life sentences for racketeering, extortion, and complicity in 11 murders for which he was convicted in 2013. He had spent 16 years as a fugitive of law. So what kind of stuff had he done? Well, he was a leader of the Winter Hill Gang. It flourished under the protection of a corrupt FBI handler, John Connolly, who is now in prison himself, I believe. I think he's still in prison. They protected him using the corrupt Department of Justice and the corrupt FBI. Yes, boys and girls, there is a lot of corruption in the Department of Justice and the FBI, and it didn't just begin with the election of President Trump, with coming after President Trump because Hillary Clinton didn't get elected. Yes, that's where they exposed themselves. They were so desperate that they exposed the corruption that's been there for a very, very long time. And of course, we've seen it in many other cases. We've seen it in the case of Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road case. We've seen it in the case of the Bundy family, and still ongoing. I mean, even after you've had a whistleblower blow the lid off of that persecution of the Bundys, and the judge shut it down, dismissed it with prejudice, saying you can't open this up again. This corrupt Department of Justice, still operating with a lot of hangovers from the Obama administration, is still trying to come back after them. But let's talk about Whitey Bulger. Some of his worst and most notorious crimes. At the beginning of his career, he was a bodyguard for the Killeen gang. He was a bodyguard and an enforcer. In other words, an assassin. And they were at war with another Irish gang in Boston, the Mullen gang. So the Mullens and the Killeens, Hatfields and McCoys. No, they were Irish organized crime. He met in 1972 with the leader of the other gang, the Winter Hill gang, another gang rather, and he promised to stop this war between these gangs. And the guy that he was protecting wound up having a machine gun emptied directly into his face. And they believe that Whitey Bulger was the trigger man in that. And so that was his opening move into power. Then he began running guns for the IRA. Now, that murder was in 1972. In 1975, according to testimony from other people in the trial where he was convicted in 2013, he became an FBI informant in 1975. So 3 years after he rises to power by assassinating the guy that he was supposedly working for and protecting. He becomes an informant in 1975. In 1984, 9 years later, he is finally caught running guns and bombs to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. So this is while he is an FBI informant. And he's been an FBI informant for 9 years. But the Irish Navy intercepts a boat that Whitey and his associates had filled with a cargo of 163 assault rifles, 71,000 rounds of ammunition, 12 bulletproof vests, 2,000 pounds of military explosives, and other weapons valued at between $500,000 and $1 million. And this is while he is an FBI informant, 9 years after he became an FBI informant. A former protege of Bulger testified that he, Bulger, and a guy named Steve Flemmy were complicit in killing several people. He turned state's witness, so he blew the whistle on these other guys. They killed people that they suspected of being rats. They concealed their bodies in the basement of a home in South Boston, and then they relocated them on Halloween night in 1985. Oh, kind of like these bodies that turned up on Halloween, or the day before Halloween, at the Vatican. We're going to talk about that in the next hour. Leo Zagami is going to come on later in the program with us as well. People that were murdered, their bodies stuffed in the basement. Now they're trying to determine if this was a young lady who disappeared in the mid-1980s. Well, back in the mid-1980s, Whitey Bulger was killing other people and burying their bodies in the basement and then relocating them on Halloween night. 3 of them were particularly brutal, but there were 8 others, 11 of them. He was also convicted of extorting drug dealers in his community for nearly $30 million. So this guy's not too good a guy, right? And yet Bob Mueller wasn't doing too much about it. As Alan Dershowitz said in April of this year, he said, Mueller is a zealot, but we got to remember he's the guy who kept 4 innocent people in prison for many years in order to protect the cover of Whitey Bulger, who was operating as an FBI informant. And again, he had been an FBI informant even 9 years before he's supplying weapons to the Irish terrorists, the IRA. He said, those of us in Boston don't have such a high regard for Mueller because we remember this story. The government eventually had to pay tens of millions of dollars in compensation to the people that were locked up who were innocent because Bob Mueller wanted to protect Whitey Bulger, a notorious mass murderer. And he said that's regarded in Boston as one of the greatest scandals of modern judicial history. And Mueller was right at the center of it, said Dershowitz. So he's not without criticism by people who know him in Boston. That's what Dershowitz said. Here's what Gohmert said. He put out some summaries of Bob Mueller and his history. Part of this was he said Mueller, as assistant U.S. attorney, then as acting U.S. attorney in Boston, wrote letters to the parole and pardon boards throughout the 1980s that opposed clemency for the 4 men who were framed by FBI lies. These same people that were kept in jail for years, that were eventually paid tens of millions of dollars in compensation because the FBI framed them. They were innocent of the charges. They framed them to protect Whitey Bulger. And Mueller was the acting attorney who put them in jail and kept them in jail. And Gohmert points that out. He said Whitey Bulger was helping the FBI cart off his criminal competitors even as he buried bodies in shallow graves along the river after he moved them from the basement on Halloween night. I could not find, says Gohmert, any explanation online by Mueller as to why he insisted on keeping the defendants in prison that the FBI agents in the pocket of Whitey Bulger had framed for a murder that they did not commit. But it was part of a pattern that eventually became quite clear that Bob Mueller was more concerned with convicting and putting people in jail that he disliked, even if they were innocent of the charges, than he was with ferreting out the truth, said Congressman Louis Gohmert. Law enforcement sources in the Daily Mail say that Whitey had been talking about outing people in the FBI, people who were in the top echelon of the informant program that you had Bob Mueller knee-deep in. And so then all of a sudden, he gets transferred for no apparent reason, this 89-year-old who wants to out people in the FBI. Why would he be interested in that? Why would he? Well, everybody's going back and looking at Mueller and his connections to Whitey Bulger. Whitey never said anything about it. And now he's about to do that. So they wheeled him away from security cameras as they transferred him without explanation suddenly to this West Virginia prison where they'd had 3 people murdered in the last year. It's a place where you could reliably get somebody taken out. He's wheeled away from the security cameras, beaten with a lock and a sock, and had his eyes gouged out. Yeah. Friend of Mueller. And we'll tell you, what did Mueller know and when did he know it when we come back? Stay with us. Welcome back. I mentioned it briefly yesterday and put up the video about the suspicious death of Whitey Bulger, his connections to Bob Mueller. I didn't go into a lot of detail, and I'm going to go into detail on this now. We put it up. We called it whack-a-mole. And that's basically what happened. You had a whack-a-mole situation. A guy, 89 years old, serving multiple life sentences. Not going to be too long, actually, but multiple life sentences for just a few of the crimes that he committed over the many years that he was being protected and run by the FBI informant program. And then he said, after he'd refused to talk all these years, he said, I'm ready to talk to some people. That has been rumored. So he was rapidly shifted to a prison in West Virginia where 3 people had just recently been murdered in prison, other informants who talked about that. And he was promptly murdered gangland style on entry. Now, it could be some other gang besides the FBI that wanted to kill him, but it could also be the people that were around Bob Mueller. Let's go back not quite a year ago, December 2017, an article from Washington Babylon, not the Babylon Bee. This is not a satire. This is actually true. Point out, earlier this year, the Justice Department appointed Bob Mueller to serve as a special counsel. And everybody is just, it goes on talking about how everybody's putting him out here as this sainted figure Boy Scout, glowing coverage. Nobody talks about the fact that he botched an anthrax investigation by ignoring a solid lead, fingering an innocent man. That resulted in $5.8 million award to that innocent man. I just told you how, as a prosecutor in Boston, the FBI had lied and framed 4 innocent men, sent them to jail, and the prosecutor on that was Bob Mueller, and he kept them in jail for a very long time. And they had to pay out tens of millions of dollars to them for keeping them in jail. So in this particular case, $5.8 million, tens of millions of dollars for framing and jailing innocent people in order to protect Whitey Bulger. That was what the FBI was doing and Bob Mueller were doing at the time. Also, his silence as the Bush administration lied about Iraq as a pretext for war, working with the Bush administration with their torture program, covering that up, information, just like Gina Haspel, because he became FBI director 1 week before 9/11. Oh, yeah, he may know where some other bodies are buried as well. Anyway, he worked with Attorney General John Ashcroft to map out ways to use torture and terror investigations. And then he goes on to say, to the extent that anyone inhaling his bona fides paid any attention to his role in the notorious Boston criminal kingpin, James Whitey Bulger, it was to describe the arrest in 2011 as a masterful job of FBI investigation. But in fact, the case of Whitey Bulger, a fugitive who had eluded capture for 16 years, had been one of the biggest scandals in the history of the FBI. And the Bureau's official story of its resolution is so preposterous that it either casts a withering light on the competence of Mueller and his G-men, or it reeks of something smellier in Mueller's closet. From 1979 to 1995, Whitey Bulger engaged in a criminal reign of terror that eventually established him as one of the most powerful underworld bosses in New England. In late 1994, he was tipped off by his FBI handler, John Connolly, that indictments were imminent, and he disappeared, went on the lam. Questions about the FBI's relationship with Bulger, while he dominated Boston's criminal underworld in the 1980s and 90s, have never been fully resolved. The corrupt relationship existed between the FBI and Whitey Bulger, and that is undisputed. From the 1970s, Bulger had been a confidential informant of the FBI. And again, in the trial in 2013, they said it was since 1975. And 9 years later, he's actually supplying terrorists with weapons. Supplying terrorists, kind of like we do with ISIS. Kind of like we used the Saudis as a beard for 9/11. That kind of thing. And then we have Bob Mueller in there. He's just the kind of guy you want directing the FBI if you're going to pull off 9/11, right? Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're going to take a quick look at the shady history of Bob Mueller, the guy that was Johnny on the spot. You know, who are you going to turn to if you want to overthrow the Constitution? Well, you might get a guy who has been reliably compliant in terms of working with Whitey Bulger, a guy who looked the other way when weapons were being shipped to terrorists in the Irish Republican Army and so forth, running him as an FBI informant, just as we have this partnership that's been ongoing between the Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS. It's great to have people in power who will do that. And then, of course, it's great to have a guy like Bob Mueller. After you've overthrown the Constitution with 9/11, you can overthrow the election of Donald Trump, who's going to push that back. So let's take a look at the case of Whitey Bulger, the man who was suspiciously murdered gangland style, showing that there's obviously some corruption inside the prison system at the very least. Whether this goes to Bob Mueller is yet to be examined. But let's take a look at what happened under Mueller's tenure there in Boston. This is very well documented. One of the FBI handlers, John Connolly, who began handling him in 1975, 9 years before he started transferring weapons to Irish terrorists, is currently serving a lengthy prison sentence in Florida for the murder of a Whitey Bulger associate who is rumored to be cooperating with a criminal investigation. So this is an FBI guy who is running the informant program, and Whitey Bulger is being helped by that. They're using the FBI essentially to take out the gangland enemies, the rivals of Whitey Bulger, including the FBI informant, the guy running the program, working for the FBI, offing some of these guys himself and being convicted of that murder. Connolly's supervisor, John Morris, has admitted to tipping off Bulger about another cooperating witness, and he has been given protection for that. This is information that Bulger used to murder this man. He was a mobster who was desperately seeking witness protection. And when they killed this guy that was trying to get witness protection, and because John Connolly tipped him off, an innocent bystander was also killed. And that was in 1982. Again, 2 years before they were caught shipping weapons to Irish terrorists. Morris got immunity for cooperating. Additionally, he admitted to receiving $7,000 in cash bribes from Bulger. So these are two FBI guys there. Two FBI guys are saying, hey, this other guy's about to blow a whistle, and he kills him, kills an innocent bystander at the same time. And then some of these guys were killed by John Connolly. So when Connolly alerted Bulger that he was about to be arrested, he hit the road, and nobody heard from him for 16 years. Connolly had also thwarted previous investigations of the Boston Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police Department. Those agencies had seen this happen so many times that they wouldn't cooperate with the Boston FBI on any of these organized crime cases anymore. They knew that it was compromised. And eventually they got Connolly and these other guys. By numerous accounts, Bulger and his partner in crime, Stephen Flemmy, who actually turned state's evidence against Whitey. So Flemmy turned state evidence against him as well as the other person. That's where they were talking about killing people and burying their bodies in the basement. One guy, he tried to strangle him, but the rope was too thick. And so he says to the guy, hey, you want one in the back of the head? And he goes, yeah, you can do that instead of this other stuff, right? Gave him a choice of how he wanted to kill him. Anyway, he says, Whitey believed that he was not going to be prosecuted, if only because that he had secrets that he could spill. He said, if I'm going to go to jail, you're going to go to jail. He once threatened Morris, saying that, and Morris soon after that suffered a heart attack, so that kind of ended at that point. They said, where was the nation's future top cop, Bob Mueller, in all this? Throughout the 1980s, as this was happening. Well, again, he was there in the corrupt Justice Department, where he was working with the FBI that framed innocent people, 4 of them, put them in jail for many, many years, paid tens of millions of dollars eventually. He put them in jail, framed them for that, and he was the head of the Justice Department there in Boston. He was a U.S. attorney for the District of Massachusetts while that was going on. That's what Dershowitz was calling out. Also called out by Louis Gohmert for that. So as this person points out, it's at least likely that Mueller was very well aware while he was there in Boston that there was a lot of this stuff going on, especially since he put innocent people in jail. Because Bulger was a high-order rat, ultimately, he never did spill the secrets. He preferred to hold on to the fiction that he never had informed for the FBI. We still don't know the extent to which the government enabled racketeering and murder, but he said he was going to talk. That's what he told people who told the Daily Mail. And then he was quickly transferred to this prison and killed on entry. The government's assassination of Bulger's fellow Mark on the most wanted list, Osama bin Laden, in 2011, caused a lot of people to criticize the American government. The Pakistan government. They said, how could you be holding Osama bin Laden for all these years and not even know that he's there? And so you have the Pakistan ambassador to the U.S. at the time said, well, if Whitey Bulger can live undetected by the American police for so long, then why can't Osama bin Laden live undetected by the Pakistani authorities? And so at that point, Bob Mueller says, find Whitey Bulger. And in 7 weeks, they find him. When in 16 years, they couldn't find him. Maybe they didn't want to look. Who knows? So now we got Mark Meadows asking a FISA court judge, because this is kind of you look at the shady history of Bob Mueller, and you ask about all the stuff that happened in Boston, that kind of inconveniently comes up with the death of Whitey Bulger. It might have been even more inconvenient if Whitey Bulger hadn't died, might it? And as all this stuff is happening, Louis Gohmert is exposing it, Dershowitz, other people in Boston. It's an open secret in Boston. Mark Meadows, who is there with the House Freedom Caucus, one of the top Republicans in Congress, is asking the presiding judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court He said, you are privy to information which could potentially verify or contradict our understanding of the abuses of the FISA process. Now, the FISA process would be abused? I mean, who would think that some kind of a star chamber court would abuse the judicial process? Who would think that somebody like Bob Mueller, who had worked with Whitey Bulger and had covered for him for decades, and then didn't look for him for decades until it became a political football. Then they had to find him. And then he wouldn't talk. But then when he says he's going to talk, all of a sudden he dies. Who would think that there would be something strange happening with all this? Who would think that when you have a star chamber that it would be used for these kinds of purposes or this kind of person? It was as he was picked, there was one lawyer who said, I've got a long history of Bob Mueller. He tried to set me up with a wire. I also had, he was representing a client, and he said, some guy comes in and says, I can prove that your client didn't take this money in a criminal way, and I can give you checks. And they go, okay, great. Well, let me have you sign this paper and so forth. Well, I don't really want to do that. And he said, the guy walks out, and he could tell that he was wearing a wire. And he confronted Bob Mueller, and he goes, yeah, we're setting you up on that, trying to see if you would work with him in an underhanded way. Well, I think Bob Mueller worked with Whitey Bulger in an underhanded way. Certainly looks like it to a lot of people. Louis Gohmert, Alan Dershowitz, many, many people are saying that. He went on to say that there was tremendous prosecutorial misconduct in the case of Jeffrey McDonald. That was the guy who they kind of based the story of The Fugitive on. They accused him of murdering his wife. He said it was not an one-armed man, but he said it was somebody else, and he was an innocent man. Well, there'd been several mistrials. Bob Mueller was at the top of that, and when he came in as part of the appeals legal team, Bob Mueller came in and said, criticism of the FBI or any of the prosecutors is off the table. You will not criticize us. He said, this guy is a Torquemada. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We need to go back and revisit the foundations of our freedom. Our freedoms don't consist of the things that are enumerated on a piece of paper. It consists of the things that we're willing to fight for. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the rest of the Bill of Rights are prohibitions. They're prohibitions against powerful organizations and individuals taking those God-given rights from us as individuals. You better understand that, because they're taking them right now. We have seen what they want to do. They called it UN Agenda 21. Now they call it the UN 2030 Agenda. They want everybody off of the rural lands. They want people out of the suburbs. They want to pack everybody into the cities, because that's where it is easiest for them to control everyone.
Never missed your show any day. I mean, never.